First of all, welcome everyone, and thank you very much indeed for coming along this evening to our final Professional Law Institute talk on the rise of the in-house lawyer as part of our lecture series here at the Dickson Poon School of Law at King's College London. We're competing with at least two other legal events both in King's and externally tonight, so I'm particularly glad that you've turned out this evening for this talk. As with previous talks, we will be recording this evening's talk, so you can also watch it again online afterwards and or tell those who couldn't be here this evening. I'd also like to thank Madeline Ryan. I don't know if she's here, she's not here at the moment. Madeline is our events coordinator who's brought together this event this evening, and I'm very grateful for all her work, both tonight and for our previous talks. And of course, I'd like to thank our two speakers who I'll introduce in a couple of moments' time. First of all, perhaps most importantly, after the talk this evening, there will be some drinks in the lecture theatre, the museum rather beside us. So do join us for a drink and a catch up and some networking after the event tonight. So our talk tonight is on the rise of the in-house lawyer, which was my title. I always tend to think of things like The Terminator and other film titles when I'm coming up with titles for events like this, but I think it is right to emphasise what a dramatic change there's been over the last 10 years or so in the profile of legal practice, both in this country and globally. And I'm sure Nigel and Deepak are going to talk through some of the statistics around that. But I think this is a particularly prescient talk to have as the final talk in our series, because it really is a natural development from the discussions we've had in the previous two seminars. We started out in the first talk looking at future roles for lawyers, and we heard from two young lawyers with a particularly innovative approach and a particularly innovative practice. And then in our last session we had Maury McLaren and Richard Macklin talking about the shape and scale and scope of law firms in the years to come. I think what we got from that talk was a very strong sense of how, both in terms of legal advice and the type of legal advice that's going to be necessary in the future, the types of technology and how they're going to change practice, that there's going to be a real shaking up of the foundations and a real change in the profile of firms. And I think one of the outcomes, one of the threads of that talk, was the extent to which clients can, if you like, take the law into their own hands. They have a set of tools and abilities more than ever before to develop their own in-house practice, which leads us to tonight's talk and the extent to which in-house practice actually is going to predominate for the remainder of the 21st century. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers to talk about this topic this evening. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in detail, but just to give a few headlines about their careers and why we've invited them along tonight. So Deepak Malhotra is currently a member of the advisory board for the Global General Counsel Academy. In addition to that, he's written extensively on the future of the in-house lawyer, not least a piece for the Law Society, who I think are also tonight holding an event on in-house practice called Leadership Beyond the Law, part of their collection of essays on the future of the in-house lawyer. Prior to his current role as a corporate advisor to blue chip companies on strategy and in-house practice, he had 13 years as a general counsel at several leading multinationals. And he also acted as head of strategy and transformation for a media company in recent years. So he brings an incredible wealth of experience, and I think it's fair to say that Deepak is at the forefront of what's happening in the in-house practice market. Nigel Spencer is a good friend of King's College London. I'm delighted to say he's a graduate of King's College, and annoyingly he's one of those frustratingly talented all-rounders. He started out at King's with a degree in classics, in which he obtained, I think, his first-class honours, and he then did his PhD at King's in the very impressive-sounding social and cultural change. And I'm sure he can talk to you about that over drinks afterwards, and I'm sure it'll impact on this talk. Having established himself as an academic in all things classics, he then turned his hand to accountancy practice and then to in-house practice working for global law firms, most notably Reed Smith, where he was Global Director of Learning and Development for 6 years. He's now based at the Saïd Business School, where he's Senior Client Director in Oxford, and in his tenure in that role, he's taking their projects forward, but still continuing to write extensively on law, on technology, on strategy and innovation. I also Googled and linked in his list of awards. I'm not going to read them all out because it would be embarrassing, I'm sure, for him and for all of us in terms of the extent of his achievements. But just to give a couple of examples, he was shortlisted for Best Collaboration with External Specialists, and he achieved an award for Best Overall Learning Programme for an Enhancement of Client Skills Programme. So I could go on with his CV extensively, but he's extremely well placed and a great friend of King's College London. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nigel to begin tonight's talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here, everyone. So I'm going to say a few introductory words and then sort of hand over to Deepak to introduce himself, and then we're going to go through the session, which we've got in 3 sections, basically. So first of all, Deepak's going to take us through a section on almost what is in-house, what does that mean, what has it meant, and how's that changing, so almost the context of the talk tonight. We're then going to do a bit of a retrospective but also a slightly forward-looking piece on what's changed in the market over the last 10 years, going back to the title of tonight, of the rise of the in-house lawyer. So, you know, as you said, Chris, in the last talk there was a lot about how the legal market's changing and how that ecosystem is changing of law firms, clients and all of that. But what has that meant for the in-house role itself? So we're going to look through and have a look through all the different, a number of phases in the market and what that meant for changes both from an in-house point of view. And we'll try and run that as a conversation really with, you know, Deepak giving some perspectives of what happened in-house of those phases, and then myself adding in some thoughts from being in the law firm as well at that time, you know, how was that dynamic between firms and in-house. So we'll do that as the next main section. And then lastly, we'll have a think about some of the skill sets as well. So again, all of you here looking forward in your careers, you know, we're very conscious that perhaps tonight can be helpful in the sense of, well, what does it mean being in private practice or being in an in-house role? What does that look like in terms of skill sets and perhaps opportunities as well? So we wanted to give you some insights on that as well and give you some thoughts around that. So that's kind of the structure we'll do. Very happy, if anyone is sort of burning with a question, we're very happy to take that as we go along, and you know, that's absolutely fine. What we'll try and do is leave some time at the end as well, so we have time for some questions at the end too. So feel free to, as I said, I'll stop hitting the microphone. Feel free to sort of throw in some questions as we go along, that's absolutely fine. And yeah, so we'll go from 3 sections. So I think just to say as well, we're very conscious there's a very mix of experience in the audience. So we'll try and structure this and sort of throw in some thoughts, both for those of you, you know, perhaps slightly more experienced, slightly, you know, starting out and gaining some knowledge. So we'll try and hit all the buttons in for the audience. So without further ado, I think Deepak, shall I hand over to yourself just to give us a little bit of context first of all about the in-house. What does in-house mean?
So Chris, Nigel, thanks very much. Evening everyone, great to be here. So let's get straight into it. The rise of in-house counsel. So my perspective, without wishing to reiterate too much of what Chris was saying, is that I qualified in the city just over 20 years ago. I worked for 3 Fortune 500 companies as a general counsel, those 3 companies being Gillette, AB InBev, which is the world's largest beer company, and then Constellation Brands, which is the world's largest, or was the world's largest wines and spirits company. So I'm pleased to say that 2/3 of my career was spent in the alcohol industry. I guess that's the definition of happy days. And really my role spanned across various different areas. Started off in legal, then went into corporate affairs, I led communications, did property management, and I think that's one of the great things that you can do as an in-house counsel. You can join a company as a lawyer, but really from there you can go on to do anything you want to do, anything where you feel that your skill set naturally takes you. In my case it was into these areas. So many of my in-house legal colleagues, not just at the organisations that I work for, but other companies, went on to lead transformation programs. Some of them went on to become CEOs, and that's something we're going to talk about a little bit later. And since 2011, I've been doing a mixture of legal consultancy. Chris talked a bit about that earlier. So, what does in-house mean? But before I put this chart up, just a quick straw poll. Who in the audience feels that they've got a good handle on what being an in-house counsel means? Hands up. Spencer. So for those of you who have raised your hands, could you maybe share with the rest of us what your thoughts of being an in-house lawyer are?
We have one where I work. She is basically a jack of all trades when it comes to everything that we do and all of our functions. So she liaises a lot with the government. We're an ALB, so she liaises a lot with the government procedure. But yeah, generally advises on all manner of things.
Right, okay, fantastic.
I personally work for BP in the legal team. What in-house counsel means to me is much better hours than in private practice.
Right, interesting.
And also much more hands-on work because you actually get to follow the transformation program, for example, all the way through without discontinuity.
Okay. Anyone else add to that? Okay, so here is my take on what it means to be an in-house lawyer. And at the end of the day, there's no one size fits all. Everyone's experience, everyone's perception will be different. This is my perception. Firstly, and I think most importantly, this, by the way, was the reason why I went in-house and why I moved from private practice to wanting to work for a company. Because I wanted to be closer to the decisions and to the decision makers. And I think that that's so important. Anyone who feels that they've got an entrepreneurial flair, anyone who feels that they want to understand what it's really like to make a business decision. Being an in-house counsel is a fantastic way of learning about that, but more than just learning about that, about being able to truly influence those decisions and the direction of that decision making. So it's about making things happen. I talked about the decision making, and that for me was actually probably the single most rewarding aspect of anything that I did in-house, being close to those decisions and those decision makers. As a necessary part of that, you do gain a very intimate understanding of the business or businesses if you're lucky to work for more than one, and ultimately the sectors within which you operate. Because that's really what being an in-house counsel is all about, understanding the context within which you are expected to provide legal advice. And you can go on to broaden your skill set into a number of non-legal areas. I've listed them here. The key one that I've not put down here that I always enjoyed was that I got media training. Now, if you're working for a law firm, there's very few private practice lawyers, even those who become managing partners, etc., who actually get media training. So the range of skills that you get access to as an in-house counsel, I think, is unparalleled within the legal profession. And we're going to talk more about this later, a much greater exposure to some of those softer skills, the chairing of meetings, the ability to stand up in front of a group of people, to present slides. You would regularly do that as an in-house counsel, whereas as a private practice lawyer, you might get to do that, but not with the same degree of frequency. And the range of role. So I've always been a general commercial lawyer, but if you were to go in-house, you can go in-house into such a broad range of roles. You could be an employment lawyer, an IP lawyer, tax lawyer, you could be a litigator, a real estate lawyer. So it's back to what I was saying earlier, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all. And really being in-house requires what I would suggest is a real plethora of skills. And I would identify those as obviously giving legal advice. That's what you're paid to do, to give legal advice within context and to advise the business on its legal position. But so much more than that. You're a crisis manager. So many companies, and we hear about it, we read about it all the time, have their individual crises. And as the in-house counsel, you are expected to be a crisis manager. You're expected to be a risk manager, to advise on risk scenarios, to provide risk advisory, to advise on compliance. You're expected to be a functional leader. Quite often you'll have the legal team that you are expected to lead. So you're a business leader and you're a functional leader, all wrapped into one. And if you're advising the CEO or the board of directors then you become their confidant. So you've got this very broad range of skills and roles that really comprise being an in-house counsel. Quick slide on the growth of the in-house legal community. Around 20 years ago, it was genuinely a very small part of the overall legal profession. That's not the case today. So it's doubled in the last 15 years, and later we're going to talk about whether that's going to continue. I certainly believe it will, and we'll talk about the reasons why. And today you've got in excess of 28,000 lawyers working in-house. That's a huge number. And not only do they work for the sorts of organisations that I work for, i.e. multinationals, but they work right across the board. Public sector, not-for-profit, charities, all manner of companies, startups, PE-backed ventures, etc., etc. And what you're also seeing in-house is a sizable number, a significant number of lawyers who are working in private practice are now being seconded in-house. From the law firm perspective, they want their lawyers to get closer to their clients, so they're happy to second them in. And from our perspective as a client, we're obviously grateful for the additional set of resources, so it really is a win-win. Nigel?
Yeah, thank you, Deepak. So that's a little bit of context for us. Thank you, Deepak. And what we wanted to do now, as I said, was just have a walk through some of the dynamics of what's developed, what's changed. I mean, Deepak's already hinted about the growth there. And just to do this in looking at the market, and then I'll just throw some questions over to Deepak as we go along. We'll have a bit of a discussion about the firm perspective and the client perspective as well. Okay, so a bit of a sort of, with some humour here. I said when the legal services market was more simple. Some time ago. Although perhaps it was never quite as simple. So there would be Deepak in his client world, in the in-house role. There would be the likes of Sam, who was a partner in firm, in Simmons. There would be the firm. There would be us in the firm providing services. But actually, of course, it was always slightly more complex because what was Deepak doing? Often, especially in those big multinationals, you were managing a panel, for example, a panel firm, and that's almost one of the themes. I thought it would be interesting to explore, first of all, Deepak, again, from your point of view. So I was just curious, first of all, in terms of when you were managing, so some of the big InBev and some of those big firms you were part of, what were the challenges? What were the things that you had to juggle? What was challenging when you were almost managing those external providers, and there were quite a few of them, perhaps as I've drawn in the picture? Yeah.
So I think the first thing to say is I completely agree with what you said around the evolution of the structure of providing legal services from law firms to their clients. And as you put up in the first chart, it was 20-25 years ago much more transactional. Clients would engage law firms for a particular matter, and they would transact with that law firm around the obtaining of advice. But there was a change, and I think that this really coincided with the evolution of the business model of those clients, because that then required a different type of procurement in terms of external legal services. And that's really where the whole panel concept came from. So as clients, as they got bigger, as they expanded across different frontiers, products, services, jurisdictions, etc., there was this need to use a much broader array of law firms. And as you quite rightly point out, that creates challenges in itself. The first challenge is, if you're using more than one law firm provider, how do you get consistency of advice, consistency of quality, consistency of style of delivery, consistency of approach? Because there's nothing worse than having different house styles, if you like. So if you're working with 6 or 7 different law firms, having to work with those firms in 6 or 7 different ways. So that's the first challenge. Then the second challenge is really developing the sort of synergies between those law firms. So one of the things that we were very keen to do in-house was to develop our own bank of precedents, our own template of contracts that we could then call our own. So getting the law firms to provide those to us, obviously as part of the overall service, we wouldn't expect to be charged for that. and getting the law firms on your panel to engage with one another. Because sometimes there was this fear, would they be treading on toes?
Okay. Was there any reticence of them sharing that you had to deal with as well? Was that?
I think initially, yes, because so many of the law firms, of course, compete
Yes.
with one another.
Yeah.
And they sometimes feel that, ultimately law firms, what are they selling?
Yeah.
They're selling knowledge.
Yes. Yeah.
So the idea that they would impart knowledge into an environment where their competitors are also playing, I can see that, that's kind of a toe-curling exercise for them.
Yeah. And one thing I've always been curious about, in terms of, we always used to think about in the firm, the criteria for buying from different clients. So, I mean, long story, obviously, and a very, very complicated question in a way. But, for example, could you easily differentiate firms on the basis of expertise?
Difficult to answer.
Yeah.
And I would answer that in two ways. Law firms make a big thing of selling knowledge, selling their expertise.
Yeah.
And I get that.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, as a client, your perspective as a client is that that's a given.
Right. Yeah.
It's just like if you are a student at King's, it's kind of a given that you will have access to fantastic teachers, fantastic facilities, great resources. Same as a client when you're buying in legal services.
Yes.
And law firms make a big deal about, the level of their expertise.
Yeah.
We think that's a given. So, of course, you are paying for advice, but, I would suggest that we take that for granted. So, in terms of differentiation between law firms, quality of advice as of itself, I think it's quite difficult to say, well, that law firm is of the highest quality and maybe that law firm isn't. So you tend to differentiate based on other factors. Price.
Well, I was going to ask about price.
That's a great example.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because obviously there's this ongoing pressure to, for example, to do more with less.
Yes.
There's this scrutiny on budgets that in-house counsel feel, where you've got the CFO over your shoulder. What's your budget for this year? Could we maybe take 5 or 10 or 15% off your budget?
Yeah, because I was going to ask that. What almost the pressure's on you in-house from, say, the board, from, so that was a regular conversation, wasn't it, about what's your external spend?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And actually, when you think about one of the key reasons which has fueled the rise of the in-house market, that rise that we talked about earlier, where we've now got nearly 30,000 in-house. One of the key reasons behind that is to get a better sense of procurement and more effective management of the services being provided by external counsel to organisations. And who better to handle that than your in-house legal team?
Yes. Yeah. So when you were involved, your teams grew. Did they significantly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was just my empire building. but I mean, that's a different issue. Nigel, I'd be interested in your perspective. You asked about my perspective from through the client's lens.
Yeah.
About law firms being on a panel and panel management. What's your perspective from the law firm?
Well, it was interesting, I say. We've got people such as Sam in the audience as well to perhaps give perspective too. But I think there's an interesting thought around this of, especially for key clients, so ones that were defined as key clients, what is our level of investment was often a key decision, actually, in the sense of secondees. You talk about secondees. I mean, that was a really interesting debate in the firm all the time, because even if you're even if you are quite a large firm, in a way you're quite lean. When you actually break it down to, say, the financial markets team or the employment team or whatever, you might only have 2 or 3 associates at a certain level. You might only have 1 or 2 trainees in that area. So suddenly there's discussion when 5 different clients say to you, can I have someone on the secondment? That becomes a really interesting thought, actually, saying, how do we manage that? And so, which takes you, I think, to that broad thought of the level of investment versus, in terms of some of the different client relationships you have. So that was often one discussion about, how do we manage this? We're getting lots of requests for this. Discuss. So that was just one thought about the level of investment. Price was an interesting challenge. You know, again, what margins are we expecting to make? What margins can we make? Can we make on this? You know, some of those discussions, and perhaps in your, you know, I'd be interested. You know, did you have any of those discussions around volume of work versus volume discount, for example? You know, those types of discussions are one. As price became more of an issue, and as you say, Deepak, in this sort of market, it became increasingly competitive to get sort of different, you know, between different firms. If you were buying even slightly on price, that was, you know, we were very conscious of that, I think. You know, so it's a very interesting dynamic, that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think this whole thing around price is, what type of work is it? I think it's much easier to have a price conversation with your law firm if you're talking about commodity type work.
Yes.
The sorts of work where you would regularly just churn it out.
Yeah.
I think the more specialised the area of work, you know, I think that there's a strong argument from the perspective of the law firm to perhaps charge a premium for that.
Yeah. And that takes us on to that thought, which we'll come on to later, about automation and some of the stuff that we talked about already in the talks already. So I think that's really, and the other thing just to throw in at this stage as well, I think, is we were often thinking about, you know, where could we create almost the win-win in the relationship, really? So, you know, was there something actually that we could offer that actually would be really valued? So we had lots and lots of conversations around, certainly about our key clients, and tried to work out, or even ask, what would you really value? You know, what would be valuable? And it may be a secondee, or it may be something completely different. It may be, you know, in my last place, we did a lot of stuff around, you know, client training, actually. You know, so is training useful? You know, you mentioned knowledge sharing and the precedents and things like that. So again, what is of value to different clients will be very different. And so that relationship between in-house and out-house, so to speak, I think, you know, as you say, it's very specific to each client and each relationship, really. But I think there are a number of dynamics there. I mean, Sam, I don't know if you want to add any thoughts from your perspective.
No, I completely agree with what you said. I will probably just say creativity regarding pricing became very important.
Yes.
Innovation became really important, and then deepening that relationship. Deepening and broadening the relationship became really important because it was clear it wasn't transactional anymore. It needed to be more.
Very good point. And actually, Sam's just reminded me, so another key dynamic that within the firm we used to think about, you know, you could almost draw a grid and say, okay, for this client, which practice groups do we work with this client with, and in which offices, and actually work out how embedded you were with a client, just because what you were trying to do was actually become really connected with a client in many different touch points all around their global network or wherever it was, you know, so actually there would be a really strong relationship there as well. So again, that was partly also, to your point, Deepak, of consistency for yourself as well. Again, win-win, hopefully, that actually, you know, as you say, interesting decision, you know, how many times do I give these bits of work to different firms? I mean, obviously, you know, in whatever firm you are, you might not have offices everywhere where you'd like the advice to come from. So we had a best friend network or whatever. But, you know, from an internal point of view, we were thinking, how do we deliver consistency? So it's interesting, of course, as you say, especially at this time when you were certainly having a panel of different firms. I mean, just to jump forward a few years, of course, very recently there has been sort of a reduction in panels has become a trend as well. So that whole thought of how many firms do I want to engage with from the clients, there's certainly been something that the clients have been looking at.
I think that's right, and I think there's a very interesting footnote to this as well, which is when clients instruct law firms, to what extent are they instructing the firm, or are they actually just instructing an individual or group of individuals at that firm?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, from the law firm's perspective, the law firm would say, well, it's the firm's business. You're instructing the firm. And that obviously goes towards the creation of the firm's identity, its own brand, etc., etc. But, you know, if the client meets someone at 2 a.m., are they really calling the law firm, or are they calling the mobile of the client partner, the person that they work with, and the person who they know will be there to pick up their call?
Yeah, who's invested in them.
So I think there is this sort of natural tension between the sort of brand identity of the firm and, you know, the individual.
Yes.
And maybe it isn't a tension, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think that's an interesting sort of footnote.
And did that influence sometimes how you might, I suppose it did, how you would choose, you know, your panel firms,
definitely.
I guess.
Definitely, because personal chemistry is very important.
Yeah.
You know, a firm can have outstanding credentials, be great on price, have a wonderful CV for, you know, clients such as you in your sector, But if you don't feel that personal sense of chemistry and engagement,
Yeah.
if you don't feel that you can make that 2 a.m. call, you're not going to instruct them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And ultimately, I always used to say to external counsel, we're only as good in-house as you are counterparts.
Yeah.
So we've got to make this a collaboration.
Yeah.
Because if you guys don't perform, we can't perform.
And I suppose all of these are reasons why price becomes just one differentiator, just one factor in that decision making, and actually all the added value you're discussing is the way for a firm to avoid being drawn into that dogfight on price and actually to sell themselves on a different set of criteria.
Yes, I think that's right, but the sort of the parameter around that makes it difficult is the rise of the involvement of procurement. Procurement come along, they've got criteria, they've got KPIs. One of the key ones is price.
Yes.
And you're going to have a hell of a conversation with your head of procurement if you say, no, I want to retain this lawyer or this law firm because I've worked with them for 10 years, they are fantastic. When procurement is saying, but they're charging £75 or £100 an hour more than this firm.
Who I also read are very good, and of course. Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting discussion as well. I mean, how did those dynamics play out with the procurement? I mean, was it something that you could influence, or was that difficult?
I always used to say to procurement, who's making the decision? And if you, procurement, want to make that call, if something goes wrong, it's on your head.
Just in case anybody in the audience isn't familiar with the procurement department at a firm, just explain what you mean by procurement in this context.
So I guess, who would be familiar with procurement in an organisation? So procurement would be, that part of any business that buys in goods and services. So, whether they're buying in components for whatever product they're looking to make, or whether they're buying in services such as legal services, or the full range of services, could be IT services or anything else. Typically, the procurement function would like to make sure that they're buying in at best-of-class rates. So that's where they would come in to make sure that, it's back to monitoring the legal spend in businesses.
Yeah, interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay, let's roll it forward then to when there began to be some shifts in the market. So if we roll it forward now, I've changed not the picture yet, but just the text. So back when the market started changing, we had the Legal Service Act come in after the David Clementi review in 2004. So this is when we had the shift that we talked about in some of the earlier talks, where things began to change in the legal services market in the sense of what type of players could there be in the market and what was almost permitted in the market then. So this major change here was, as I put on the slide there, as we know, and as I say, referenced in some earlier talks, deregulation, lower barriers to entry because the alternative business structures were permitted where you didn't have to be a lawyer anymore to own a law firm and to run a law firm. You could get external capital to come in. So what that led to, in effect, was a change. So now what I put on the picture there, this again going back to Deepak's world, is suddenly Deepak has more choice. Because actually not only does he have different types of law firms that actually could be quite similar in some ways, but actually you begin, and I put almost 3 extremes on here that we talked about a little bit in the last session. You might have what I call big law, so the traditional law firms. You might have one of these new alternative business structures, or you might have even one of the, I called them the big 4. When I was at PwC it was the big 6. So now it's gone down, I put up there the big 4. So one of the big advisory firms, Deloitte, KPMG, the other day in the press, KPMG again, massively growing their legal function. These are really serious players now in the legal market. Many colleagues went from some what you might call as traditional law firm over to places like PwC. EY started doing training contracts a few years ago. So all of these things. And by the way, for those looking at careers from a careers perspective, I think good news. You have such a varied choice now in terms of the career options available to you because of all these different players in the market. So I think it's really interesting now, the market from a careers point of view. I think you can have so many different types of careers now. But if we just stay with this now from your buying perspective, Deepak, and just think, so I put it here as a little question. Obviously, you had a different type of choice now. And so, admittedly, if we're taking this back to when these first started coming in the market, I suppose, well, question to you, was there a credibility thing? So you think, oh my gosh, there's these interesting new players. Do I trust them? Do I, so I don't know I'd be really interested what types of discussions this started, around, perhaps with procurement, for example, or,
well, choice is a good thing.
Yeah.
We all want choice. We're all consumers at the end of the day. And when it comes to the things that we buy for our daily lives, we like choice.
Yeah.
We like choice, we like price, we like availability, we like easy delivery.
Yes.
We like Amazon, right? That's what they deliver. That's the bottom line. So, an Amazon of legal services is effectively what the market became.
Yeah.
But in not such a prolific sort of way.
Yes.
So choice is good, and it's back to the people. Because a lot of these providers recruited individuals from law firms who had that personal credibility.
Yeah.
And if there was someone that I worked with for a long period of time, and suddenly he moved to a different firm, a smaller firm, or an alternative business structure, as you put down here, I'm happy to go with the individual.
Yes.
I know what they can do. I know that they can deliver.
Yeah.
And unless something goes horrendously wrong, it should be fine.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and because at this time I think the really interesting thing for law firms here that was hinted at a bit in the last talk is this thought of actually where do we play in the market? And so the whole thing of differentiation now became really interesting in the legal sector because, you could think of some firms that were starting from a blank sheet of paper, some legal business, I shouldn't call them firms, they were actually probably limited companies, some of them were invested in tech. They start from a blank sheet of paper, they can set up their legal function any way they want, they can say, okay, we're going to go for commoditized type work, we're going to set this up, so actually we're going to invest in tech so that we do all the automated contracts, and we're going to do lots of stuff like that, and that's where we're going to play in the market, so price is going to be low, we're going to go for volume, So, but actually I think what's really interesting is that the bigger law firms, what's much harder is actually to move from A to B. And question, even if you want to move from A to B, actually. So with your brand, I think it's very interesting that when this started happening, you saw things like Lawyers on Demand, BLP's first business, when they did a more sort of lower, more volume type business and some more investing in technology and sort of creating all those services. What did they decide to do? They decided not to almost mix it in the brand that they had already of BLP. They decided to have a different brand. Interesting, so they actually played with that. And another dynamic that comes here that almost flows into this a little bit is who supplies to who in this market as well. And again, so an impact perhaps on Deepak's world that we can explore a little bit is, Deepak, I heard sort of apocryphal stories of, clients saying to firms, okay, well, a few years ago we gave you £2 million to do this type of work and deal that we're asking you to do. But actually, we'd now like you to do it for 600,000, and by the way, can you work out how to do it more cheaply, perhaps by partnering with someone in the market, partnering with someone who has this technology that you don't yet have. So that for me was really interesting. Again, it goes back to your more for less, which of course is, started coming in there.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's more for less. It's also this concept of risk sharing. And I think if you become an in-house lawyer, one of the things that you really get to learn and become familiar with very quickly is risk.
Yeah.
And how do you risk share?
Yes.
So, one of the things I think the law firms have struggled with quite a lot is this idea that in-house counsel have pushed risk in their direction.
Okay.
And it's risk in so many different forms. It's risk in terms of money, so fees.
Yeah.
But it's risk in terms of the sorts of services that are being delivered, the added-on services.
Yes.
And of course, risk in decision making, where we as in-house counsel now expect our law firms to almost to take the decision, not themselves, in conjunction with us, but to stand by that decision.
Interesting. Yeah. And what else was so with these types of dynamics going on? As I say, where big law were perhaps partnering with one of the newer firms and delivering to you. How did that affect, for example, the dynamic on panels that we've talked about already? What did you notice there?
Yeah, some disruption.
Yeah.
We live in the age of disruption, so it's inevitable.
Yeah.
Although I would say that when you look at changes within the legal profession, they tend to be quite slow. So some of the things that I'll answer that by highlighting some of the things that I would expect to see happen.
Yeah.
And I would expect to see more tech-enables things happen in
Yes.
functionality
Yeah.
in the law.
So you really expected, say, if you had 2 or 3 large firms you work with for a long time, you would expect them to change and adopt that quite quickly.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Of course, then that requires the law firm to make a big investment in tech.
Yeah.
But as a client, you would expect firms to do that.
Yeah. And in my experience, I mean, it was really interesting that when you see in the press a lot of the thought around how easy to big firms find it to make big investments in this. And again, that goes back to my thought of actually how easy is it almost to move from one to the other, or as I put in here, because the market doesn't stay still, the market continues to evolve. And so what I've put on the slides here is, things kept changing. So for example, you have the big four. I put on a little headline there about EY. So EY, as you'll remember from last year, acquired Riverview Law. So again, one of those newer law firms. Interestingly, what did they do? EY thought, do we build that kind of capability that Deepak's just mentioned, or do we buy it? And because it's not our core competence, so actually it's probably easier if we buy it because they've got it up and running. So actually, why would we almost try and replicate that? Why would we have to do it? So I think what's really interesting to me is that I saw dynamics where it might be one of the providers I put on the slide here, one of the providers like the Big Four actually doing that, but also I saw lots of clients doing this as well, and that's exciting. Do we build this or do we buy it as well, and perhaps building their own tech functions, or partnering with law firms to actually build sometimes, create either on the number of times we saw in firms, extranets where there was like a shared working space between the client and the law firm, which was almost often sat on the law firm's IT systems, but actually was a shared sort of secure space where you might share documents. They might say, well, I want to be able to see the billing information immediately and sort of have up-to-date information on that. So I thought it was very interesting. That whole dynamic, as you say, almost of how does the client world come together with the law firm world, was something I noticed, certainly, at least.
Yeah, I think the big factor there is the size of the in-house function.
Okay.
I think if you've got a big client with a big in-house team, with a big spend, you would definitely do all of those things and more.
Yeah.
The reality is also that so much of the in-house legal roles that you see today, it's for relatively small teams. It might be a sole in-house function or a sole in-house lawyer with paralegal.
Yeah.
To be able to do all of those things that you talked about, I would query whether they have the resources, whether they have the bandwidth to be able to do that. It's back to what we were saying earlier that, I think in-house, even more so than private practice, there's no one size fits all. It's very fragmented. And I think, for anyone who's looking to go into an in-house role, it's very important to understand what kind of in-house role, what kind of company do you want to work for?
Yes.
And bear in mind also that, I don't know the exact numbers, but I would suggest the vast number, the biggest proportion of lawyers who go in-house come from private practice.
Yes. Yeah.
So they do their training in private practice and then migrate across. And there are different reasons, which we'll talk about in a minute, why they might want to do that.
Yeah.
It is possible to get some training contracts in-house.
That's right. Yes.
Where you start in-house and then, for example, spend your career in-house. But typically, and I would say probably 75, 80%, maybe more, you start your career in private practice and then move across.
Let's ask a quick question about this issue of buying in the talent and or buying in the technology. It seems to be that one of the dynamics, and you maybe talk about this more later, I don't know, but one of the dynamics is this ability that large corporates have got to potentially even buy the firm or certainly by a team, maybe if you're dealing with a particular team, or in terms of precedents, as you described earlier, to build up your own precedent banks that you can effectively... Now, at what point and where is this sort of risk shift at which it becomes less useful to... Because obviously in buying those services and conducting them yourselves, you're taking on the risk of any defect in the way those services are delivered. So where is the balance struck between the cost benefit of buying in these services and the risk benefit of being able to offset the risk on a third party?
So, I think this whole thing about risk gets sorted out through collaboration. think the whole sort of buying in of that sort of services, tech-enabled services, etc. From the client lens, it's a win-win. I don't see that risk is increased in any shape or form. I see that it's effectively managed, mitigated, and reduced. I think one of the issues for law firms is that, for example, if you've got a template, if you've got a bank of precedents that you send into the client, what's the client actually going to do with that? To what extent are they then going to try and customise that? And do they have the necessary knowledge to be able to do that?
Yes, that's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, so almost yes, question.
I was wondering, I work in private practice, you're talking about risk and resources.
Yeah.
So it's quite a broad question, because I'm sure at BP there's all the resources you need, they need they would too. But what sort of training resources are there, or have you seen in-house? Because you're saying you could do a piece of work in-house, maybe a supply contract, because you have the resources for that, but maybe you can't do a complex construction engineering contract because you need to farm that out. So what sort of training is there in-house with the clients?
Probably depends on the scale, really, I would think, doesn't it? And so, it was interesting. I mean, again, another dynamic we saw with so many clients, but it would be different for every client, was, how much training do they want? So we used to run a lot of technical training for clients. There's often a big portfolio. Certainly both my firms I was at for 6 or 7 years, a big portfolio was actually of technical training sessions that were very popular. They would often be run on a sector basis, so they might be, we'd often have lots of people who might be litigators or transactional partners or associates in the firm come and set up sessions that would be around sort of a certain sector. So we might run some for the shipping sector, or we might run some for the entertainment and media sector, or whatever it was. And then you would invite all the clients in, partly for CPD, the clients needed CPD as well. But it would be often headline issues, or it might be very practical sessions around specific issues. I think it's a really interesting question. Again, Sam, I don't know if you have any thoughts around, as you say, when we handed over, when one would give over documents, actually to say, okay, here's your access to all this suite of documents there. What almost caveats are put on that, or what sort of limits? Sorry, did you want to comment? Yes.
Yeah, just on the training point, which is a really interesting one, because that was my job. I work in private practice as a client training manager, and over about the last 8 years in particular, we've seen a huge sort of escalation in demand for both legal, technical and skills business training. And in terms of kind of how much do you just hand over to the client, I think on the particularly on the training side, it always works best where you have a very specific goal and objective in mind, and it's true collaboration. Because there is a risk that if the private practice firm just goes out and talks at the in-house team without understanding the context and the needs and the objectives. But the things that I've seen really, really succeed are a genuine co-production, if you like.
Any other colleagues? Or Ben? Yes.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting about this point about who owns the risk. Is it in-house or the legal department? Right? There's a bit of a sort of trade-off there that I've sort of picked up. Is that a lot of clients say, I want commercial advice.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they also want the law firm to take the risk if that commercial advice is not correct. I think there's a bit of a tension there. I don't know, it's a sort of topic.
Which I suppose is interesting, because that's a whole, that speaks, I suppose, to the closeness of the relationship, I guess, really. Because I guess you can, sorry, I'm making a guess here, I'll hand it to Deepak, but that thought of, are you only able to do that actually if your relationship is, close as it should be, that kind of collaboration point. So actually you can give your advice in context, a little bit, you said earlier.
Yeah.
Interesting question, actually. I mean, there's another thought there, actually, if that's question, is that why sometimes firms over the last 10, 15 years have really developed the whole industry sector focus as well? Partly they did it for differentiation purposes, but also they did it partly, I think, to help people get to know the clients in, say, the shipping sector or entertainment and media or blah, whatever the sector was, financial services, whatever it was. Yes?
To what extent is an in-house lawyer a self-training asset? Because to my mind, a good in-house is self-training. It doesn't expect them to train, it's just solving the problems that are thrown in and sets resources, manages those resources to deliver the best solution for the
Very good question. I'm going to hand that to Deepak. No, because because everything will be very contextual. Because Deepak and I have discussed this for many years, but
and not found an answer. Yeah, I mean, you can't generalise. The reality is that there is a sweet spot, and that sweet spot is the in-house lawyer knowing when they need to broaden their skill set. When they need to take on additional knowledge in certain areas, but not only identifying that need, then being able to identify how to fulfill that, whether it's through seminar programs from law firms or whatever resources. There's lots of fantastic online resources. But you're absolutely right. The reality of being in-house is that you're so entrenched in the business that you work for, and you're so almost obsessive about the provision of legal advice within the context of that business and that sector, that it's very customised. I used to say to private practice lawyers that I was working with, to what extent do you feel able, if I wasn't able to turn up to work tomorrow, just to parachute in and do my job from day one? And by and large, they would say, we don't think we could do that. And you're talking to highly experienced, highly seasoned, highly knowledgeable lawyers, but it's the context, it's the customisation that is the missing link.
Just to ask a question, I think one of the prevailing themes that's coming out of this talk tonight is that issue, that point about collaboration and the symbiotic, if you like, relationship between you as an in-house and your panel and your law firms. But I mean, to what extent have you, or are you aware of clients providing ongoing training to their counsel, as in training on the context of your business, training, I'm sure in terms of the brief that comes through, but there's another level, presumably, of education is needed to really get them inside your head as a business.
So almost in-house training there. Yeah, absolutely. It's a two-way street.
And actually,
totally agree.
We often used to have, we used to like having clients and client panels, client panel sessions whenever we could actually in some of the sessions for the lawyers, because it really helped. It really helped give the context, going back to your context.
Yeah.
I mean, another thing that was very valued, going back to how embedded in-house is in the business, another thing I always thought was really interesting was how they valued, you mentioned soft skills as well, so business skills as well as the technical skills that is very valued. Over the last few years, I did a number of sessions where we put on programs, in effect, so almost management development programs for client in-house lawyers. And amongst other things, what they really loved actually, forget all the learning stuff that was part of the session, but what they really loved, going back to your embedded point, is they love being part of a peer group. And it was really interesting because I thought, there'll be, because literally in the room there were competitors, especially when we did it on a sector basis, and I thought, how's this going to work? But actually, they loved the fact, they said, actually, I'm part of a very small team. It's so great to be able to sit with peers at other places in my sector with similar issues and almost think, oh, thank goodness, I'm not alone. Other people have that problem as well. So that whole thing of a connection and a network, they found incredibly helpful, actually, with some of the training. And so that whole thing of network connection, embeddedness, I think goes in a number of directions, actually, Chris, in a really interesting way. I'm conscious of time, so the last thing I was going to say in this section was actually just highlight even one more complex dynamic, but then you could say appeared, but was always there, was then sometimes there might be intermediaries that actually might go between the client and the providers. So this is just a headline from Legal Week from a few weeks ago, just saying why buyout firms are becoming more attractive clients than banks. And basically the point they made was, isn't it, and I think this has been going on for a number of years, but basically people like PE houses are often big influencers in the sense of which law firms their clients will use. So I remember when I was doing lots of coaching with some of the partners at one of the firms, and they said, and they were actually in the private equity group at that firm. They said, well, actually, the people I really need to get to know well are actually the private equity folk, because they're the ones that influence, which law firms banks use. So I just think it's an interesting dynamic. And Deepak, I don't know if you ever were in this situation where there were almost people, apart from procurement, whether there were any other people sort of almost influencing your...
Oh, definitely. I found that everyone in the business wants to be a part-time lawyer. It's inevitable.
Yeah.
Just as I want to be a part-time finance manager or whatever it is. I look at this chart and I see data.
Yes.
I see data all over this.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting because what you've not seen in the legal profession is, if I had a data company, if I was an entrepreneur, I would look at this chart and say there's an opportunity.
Yeah.
Because there's so much data being generated out of that kind of activity.
Yes.
And there's data to be captured, there's data to be harnessed, there's data to be provided.
Yeah.
It's a terrific opportunity.
Yeah. Because it's so complex now, with all
Absolutely. I mean, we live in the world of big data.
Exactly. So, obviously that's...
Well, that's my idea, guys, so...
Very good. Okay, Deepak, I think what we'll do now is just summarise. I'll hand over to you just to summarise, and then we'll just talk about the skill sets.
Yeah.
Just to sort of wrap up. So.
Okay, so very quickly, we talked about that increase in demand for in-house counsel. What's driven that? Lots of different factors, and I think number one, top of the list, and it's there for a reason. We've talked about providing advice in a context. It really is about the organisation needing more and more lawyers in-house who are commercially focused, commercially astute, and acting as business partners. If you become an in-house lawyer, this phrase of being a business partner, you will hear that more than any other phrase in terms of around the role. What does the role involve? That is the key message, really. And other factors, we've had this huge upsurge in terms of compliance, regulation. All of that creates risk. And the risk of non-compliance. We've seen some huge penalties. GDPR, there have been some big penalties recently. Big penalties around antitrust and competition over the years. We've had some huge fines, some into the billions of dollars.
That's right. Yeah.
So, the risk of non-compliance is huge. Third on the list is recognition of that skill set. We've talked a lot about the sort of myriad of skills that in-house counsel have. There's been a recognition by businesses that in-house bring a lot to the table beyond simply the provision of legal advice. Cost and efficiency, we've talked a lot about that. A way to manage costs, a way to improve and enhance efficiency. The management of procurement, we talked about that. And, is that outlook, is that demand for in-house counsel going to continue? I think it will.
Interesting.
I think as businesses, become ever more complex, ever more sophisticated, as the problems and challenges and questions that they have to deal with become harder to solve.
True.
I think the need for in-house counsel is just going to increase.
I mean, there's some really interesting studies on that. I think the Law Society did one saying that, by 2038 or something, they said there would be, there might be sort of less certain types of legal jobs, whether it's private or whatever. However, demand would actually increase.
Yes.
So actually, what does that turn into? It turns into different types of jobs. Again, for the people just starting their careers now, I said I think the career paths get more interesting and more broad. I also think, and I've got this in some of the white papers we've done this last year, I think also what gets really interesting is one of the pathways you can create. I mean, I think it was Linklaters a few weeks ago were in the press saying, okay, you can come in here and be an associate, but now our associates can go off down a tech path, for example, halfway through their career. I mean, that's really interesting. So I think the pathways become really, really interesting now in not just in in-house, but actually we'll come on to pathways in a second about building in-house pathways, but in law in general, I think, going back to your skill set point, Deepak, which I think actually takes us to the thought of, and we'll compare this in a minute actually, how do the skill sets, perhaps in in-house and private practice, what does that look and feel like? Because, is that changing, for example? Yeah.
So one more slide from me, and I want to talk quickly about the benefits of in-house roles. I'm biased. I've been an in-house lawyer for too long, but I am biased. I think it's a fantastic career option. I really do. I think particularly as, the pressures, that there used to be a very linear route when you're in private practice. You join as a trainee, junior associate, senior associate, you aspire to partnership. That sort of linear route has changed somewhat.
Yeah.
Nigel, your thoughts on that would be very interesting.
Yeah, it has. I mean, you've seen this partly from a retention point of view. So, what used to be, so the way the route evolved first of all was that first of all, as you say, that was exactly how it was, a very linear path. Then, partly for cost pressures as well, there started to be less spaces at the top of the pyramid, and you saw this, those of you that were the last talk about the shape of firms and how the shape of firms has changed. So if there are less spaces, sometimes, and this happened actually when I was at PwC actually way back when, you started to have these people called directors who perhaps didn't have quite the aptitude in BD skills, or actually didn't want the partner role and actually wanted that. Now in the original phase of those alternative roles, as they were called, that was almost like a one-time decision for the rest of your career originally, and you went off to be either a counsel or a director or whatever it was called. What then happened in many firms, and it's still the case now, and I think again good news for options in your career path, is actually it's become a more nuanced role where firms have actually said, actually we want this variation, but the good news is if you want to slow down your career for a few years, and we have this both men and women actually at firms I've worked with in the past, where actually they said, actually you're telling me I'm good enough and you want me to be a partner, can I just hold it for a year or two and then perhaps let's have that discussion in a couple of years' time. And so they slowed down, they perhaps went to counsel. So instead of just having that linear role, then you could go to counsel, but then not just as originally was the case, that was the end of the path. Actually, then you could go across to being a partner again. So, or you could go into a knowledge role. All of the innovation role. There are so many different roles now in firms. It's fascinating, right from when knowledge management started in as a function. I think I saw an article, it started back at Clifford Chance about 30 years ago, where I think one of the first professional support lawyers they had actually said they went to their partner they were working with at the time and said, I think there's a really important role for us to, make sure we utilise our knowledge. We're a knowledge business, for goodness sake. And so that, that turned into a whole profession. So actually, some of these roles that started off just by one or two people suggesting it, then turned into a whole career. You have junior knowledge roles, senior knowledge roles. So it becomes this almost myriad, and when people talk about a career lattice now, it's not just at junior level, actually that's become a senior career lattice too. So it's become interestingly complex, I think, Deepak. And no doubt you saw that in the in-house world, I guess as well, in terms of how teams, especially as they grew, I suppose.
Absolutely.
I remember hearing one of the big telecoms general counsel of one of the big telecoms firms once say, I can't remember how many hundreds of in-house lawyers they had, but on a panel when they were talking and they said, well actually, we actually have three pathways. So some of them want to be kind of in-house team that then goes towards general management, or some of them wants to be still stay technical. So all of those career paths, as the in-house teams evolve, actually, you've got variation there as well. So it's fascinating how that's all developed.
And that particular example plays to the second point here. Your career prospects inside and outside of the law. As an in-house lawyer, you will develop business leadership skills.
Yes.
So why not go on to become a business leader?
Yeah.
You don't have to be tethered to the law for the rest of your career, and I think going in-house gives you that option. Often get the question around, well, what does pay look like? And typically, the pay for an in-house lawyer at a comparable level to private practice is less. But you've got to look at the overall schematic. And when you're in-house, you do have access to not just that salary, which tends to be very good salaries, but often bonus structures, attractive bonus structures. And if you're working for a company that's got shares, it's listed, obviously you can participate in those share schemes. So there's real opportunity for upside other than just the salary. And obviously flexible working is now crept into all environments. It's a fantastic thing. But the last point I've got here is, and it's been my experience, that there is this I'll take your question in a second, there is a suggestion that when you go in-house, you might be working less hard. I'm not sure about that. I know you made a point earlier to that effect. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
You don't work less hard, you just work better hours. If you want to, you've got that possibility to have a better work-life balance precisely because you're not dictated by your client's deadlines.
Sure. Yeah, I remember that's what many people who did move said to me. They said, actually, it's more the predictability I care about. It's not like, as you say, it's not like I don't want to work so hard, or I don't want it to be so challenging. I'd actually just like to know more often, when I start, when I end.
I was wondering, when you're at the top and you're a general counsel, how does your salary compare to the partner in the law firm administration? Because you see so much about this online, I don't know any general counsels to ask them, so perhaps you could reach out.
We are being recorded too.
Don't send it to the taxman. No, I think it depends on the organisation and the sector you're working in. You know, you could be the general counsel of a startup. Are you going to get a great salary? No, it's not going to happen. You know, if you're general counsel of a major telecoms giant, will you get a fantastic base salary? Never mind all the add-ons, for sure. You know, you've got a very wide sort of scale within which that can operate.
And I've certainly seen from my experience a partner who I won't name who I used to work with who had one sole client, and I often used to say, you know, why didn't you simply go in-house with a client, given that all of your time and more is spent on that one particular client, or why have they not? I guess the point was that for that lawyer, her view was that she was in a better place in the firm with a greater degree of control and a greater degree of flexibility than actually going and taking on. And from the client's point of view, coming back to something you said earlier, Deepak, clearly the client took the view that person was sufficiently indispensable and they would pay for her services whether she was in-house or ex-house, as it were. So, you know, it kind of depends on your own drivers and your own context as to where you think you can get the job.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to ask us to come to a close shortly, because I think we're going to get a drink and a catch-up as well. Obviously, Nigel and Deepak will be here for drinks, so you can ask them any remaining questions. But do you want to...
Yeah, just very quickly. Just very quickly. I mean, Deepak and I, partly for some research we actually did, so we just thought it'd be interesting, you know, we've talked a little bit about this, so there's no need to labour it really, but just 3 columns really. So if we were thinking about skill sets, are they similar, are they different? You know, I think Deepak, we both thought, you know, what's in the core of probably both, so both roles, legal knowledge. We've talked a lot about the commerciality actually as well, so that point being able to deliver very commercially grounded advice. Communication and the business skills actually to be able to talk the language. I mean, when I was running training functions to actually help our lawyers communicate really well with the clients, again, the industry sector language, the knowledge, you know, how do we actually communicate? If Deepak's, you know, the business he is, how do we actually communicate in an effective way? Yeah, so the whole communication and the ability to understand, you talk about risk a lot, Deepak as well. So anything to add on that, on the boat? And then private practice, you know, and I'm trying to sort of draw, of course, by the way, there are like 3 bullet points on here, so like a zillion and one other things I could have written up here probably as well. But I think, when I think about what we were trying to help the lawyers to do, there was something around developing a niche, because they went into a practice group, so it's shipping or it's commercial or litigation, whatever it is, and then they might want to develop a niche as they got, especially for them to get promoted towards partner. You know, what's your niche, as you say, Chris, like that, for the client, you know, you're going to become indispensable to someone. So how does that work? Something about developing a niche. Something about the skills to draw clients towards your practice. Something about your brand, your profile. And lastly, I think, especially in that complicated market I drew up in one of the previous slides, being able to build collaborative teams around a problem was something that you had. So that's almost the external view. But then if you go in-house, I think it's interesting that, you know, Deepak, I'll let you talk to this, because I think there's a slightly different feel to this, isn't it, about breadth? You've talked about this a bit already.
Yeah, and I mean, you can read what's up here. I'm just going to actually focus on this last point of being comfortable with the 80-20.
Yeah.
And that's back to risk.
Yeah.
It's back to being able to and feeling confident in your own abilities and understanding of the scenario and the business to take a view. That's the 80-20. Typically, in private practice, you don't take an 80-20 view.
Yeah.
Because that flags up professional indemnity insurance. In-house, you tend to do that.
Yeah.
And I think there's a major difference there.
And I think that's a really interesting mindset difference. It's one thing that, you know, as you say, you know, the speed probably you had, the number of decisions you had to make every day when you were in-house. You know, you say, right, I've got to make this decision now. And I think private practice lawyers often find that very difficult, that shift to actually getting to say, I've got to be happy with 60% of the information. And just to end on, because I know we're pressed for time, Deepak and I did some research around sort of careers beyond sort of in the law, in-house, a couple of years ago, and then published. It's still on the website, by the way, it's still on the Reed Smith website if you want to see it. It's hopefully an interesting report. But there's lots of interviews, you know, via especially Deepak's network with CEOs, and just saying to them, okay, what skills do you look for in your lawyers, or when people are becoming really senior? And so, you know, almost like they defined for us a board skill set, which we put up there. But I remember, Deepak, that one of the things they drew out was this whole, the 80-20 point. They said, if me as CEO, they said, I've got to be happy making a decision, a little bit with my gut, on about 60% of the information I probably could have. And they said, that's daily life. That's my life as a CEO. I have to make these big decisions, you know, sometimes with not, certainly not with the full information, but actually often with much less than the full information. And it's my intuition, it's based on experience, it's based on my knowledge of the sector, or the opportunity we're having to deal with. The other thing they often talked about was, they said, the lawyers often talk about risk, narrowing stuff down, which they're trained to do. Can they almost, so that's narrowing, can they talk about opportunity? And that, again, as a CEO, they said, I've got to see opportunity for the business, because it's about growing. And actually, how do we grow our business? And that thing of risk versus opportunity, I think, is a really interesting skill set for all of you, perhaps thinking of as you plan your careers in law, to think about, how do I have a conversation, going back to language, how do I have a conversation about where we're creating opportunity as well as managing risk for the client, which you've emphasised so much. So, you know, and then just lastly, you know, succeeding in-house, technical to business aware. Again, you can read the slides there, but again, you've emphasised, Deepak, so much knowing the business and that whole sort of embeddedness in the business as well, and adapting to change. Again, lawyers, you wouldn't put top in private practice lawyers. You wouldn't put top of the list as people who are flexible, adaptable. You know, that's not necessarily the mindset, I think, that we've had historically. I think that's got to change, actually, and I think that's got to be something where the next generation, it's going to be very fast moving. The market has now moved so quickly, as you saw in those diagrams earlier, and that's really challenging.
Okay, I think I'm going to draw things to a close there. Is it a very quick question, or do you want to do it over a drink?
It's a quick question.
Okay, very quick question.
Just that I've heard from my colleagues who are in-house lawyers that there is a snobbishness associated with going to train in in-house law, and people from private practice think that you're going to be a bit crap compared to private practice traineeships.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think once upon a time, yes. Today, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
There you go, wasn't it?
I wouldn't give it a second thought.
Well, on that positive note, I think we'll draw things to a close. Thank you very much to all of you for attending. I hope you'll join us for a drink. And I'm delighted that this has been a fantastic series for all the Professional Law Institute and new colleagues, Sam Malhotra and Joe Bingham, who are here tonight with me as well. If you've got any ideas for future talks that you'd like to hear, do contact me, Chris Howard, or any of the team at King's. But I'll extend by saying one more time, thank you very much to Nigel and Deepak. You're going to find a round of applause.